Well, if you think about it, we have only experienced death from a theirs perspective, right? I mean, that's good, right? Every funeral I've ever been to was someone else's. You too, I think. Some of us got to spend some time with Lena Absher during the last few days of her life. And it was remarkable, to me at least, how confident she was moving into everlasting life. Just very anticipatory, very hopeful. And it just made me realize again that we should be confident about that. But that brings up a question, doesn't it? And it's a tough question. A very bold one. If your death were imminent, how confident would you be that you'd make it to heaven? I'm not a fire and brimstone type guy, but it really is the most important question in life. It's probably I think it's the most important question in all of the universe and eternity. What will a person do when they die? How will that be for them? Now, I suppose most of us, if we answer that, we'd say, well, gee, I hope I make it. I hope I've done enough. I hope I'm okay. Eternity is a long time to get that answer wrong. What assurance do you have? I mean, is it possible to even have any assurance? Or is it just a hope to type thing? Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, you probably know who he is, he wants to buy his way in. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, he donated 1.5 billion, yeah, that's a B, billion dollars to the Gates Foundation. And then he gave $1 billion each to the foundations of his children. So that adds up to what? $4.5 billion? Here's what he said. There's more than one way to get to heaven, but this is a great way. Is it? Is that the way? Because I don't know about you. I'm a little concerned if it's going to come down to that kind of cost, that price tag, right? USA Today surveyed wealthy American people, asked what they'd pay the most for. The wealthiest 1% of families they surveyed, what would you pay the most for? Now, you'd think they might say things like, well, it'd be like power or happiness or some material thing that they didn't have already, even though they had a lot of stuff. Love, maybe they'd say. No, it wasn't any of those. You know what it was? A place in heaven. On average, they said they'd pay $640,000 each to get there. So, they got some money. But I don't know about you. Even that makes me panic. Where am I going to get that kind of money? 640. I want us to look at the death at our death from the perspective of three men. And for the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at two men who died with Jesus and then Jesus himself. We're going to look at theirs, which for one was a tragic story of a missed opportunity, and the other was a triumphant story of a last-ditch effort to make it in. And then we're, of course, look at Jesus's, and how that makes that possible for us, for me. Theirs, his, mine. How can I walk away today from this building with the assurance that if I would die when I walk out that door, I would go to heaven? 3 crosses, theirs, mine, his. Now we're going to jump right into the scripture. We're going to go to Luke 23. All of the Gospels tell the story of the cross from different perspectives. But Luke has some statements regarding 2 men that died there with him, as does Matthew. So look at verse 33. It says, when they came to the place called the Skull, what a great place to die, a place called the Skull, there they crucified him, Jesus, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Now, by the way, we don't know much about these criminals. All we know is that the Roman government and the Jews agreed that they should die on a cross. And by the way, we don't know a whole lot about that in our day and age. However, I do understand that there are now places in the world where crosses are now being used to kill Christians. That's the kind of world we live in, friends, and we better grasp it. We better understand that. At any rate, it was a horrible way to die. I think we would all agree on that. If nothing else, you've seen the movie, you know. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us. Matthew 27 says that at one point both of the criminals hurled insults at Jesus. But then in this case, it says in Luke, the other criminal rebuked him, the one that was insulting him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly. We are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man's done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, I tell you the truth. Today, you will be with me in paradise. This was about the 6th hour, it says. Now, there is an undeniable thing about a cross. As a matter of fact, it's undeniable about death in general. It's a place of total exposure. You're not hiding anything from anybody if you're dying on a cross. Or even, for that matter, if you're dying in any manner. So, death brings forth the true nature of a human being's soul. And if you've not been around it, when you are, you'll understand that. Now, we're going to look at the souls of these 3 men over the next 3 weeks. On Easter weekend, we're going to look at the cross that frees us, his. But what about theirs? What can we relate to with these 2 men who died with Jesus? How does that affect us? How does that even speak to us? Well, let me just say this. There's 3 core elements of the human condition that surface in these 2 men. And they are dishonesty, suffering, and bitterness. Dishonesty, suffering, and bitterness. Now, both these guys were dishonest. They were criminals. Eventually, the crimes that they committed weren't just stealing bread at the local bread store, okay? You know, the Jews wouldn't even put somebody in jail for stealing. They would make them pay it back up to 5 times the amount they stole. And if they couldn't pay it back, at the last case scenario, they'd put them into slavery until they paid their debt off. So for these guys to die on a cross, it had to be much more serious, that they weren't just petty thieves, okay? These guys were hardened criminals. Maybe they did armed robbery. Maybe they had killed people in the process. One of the 2 said, hey, whatever we get, we deserve it. So they understood why they were there. At least one of them did. Now, there's a sense in which we're all dishonest people. You know, we've all stolen. You say, well, speak for yourself, preacher. I don't know if I have. Okay, so we're going to have a little moment of honesty. I know it's church, hard to do this, but we're going to have a moment of honesty here at Third City Christian Church today. We've been doing this in the last 2 services. I want to see where you stack up, okay? Moment of honesty, okay? And so, if you've never stolen anything, I want you to raise your hand. Now, before you do that, let me just say a couple things about that. I mean, like, you know, the 5th grade teacher asked her class, she said, if you found a book bag full of $5,000, what would you do? And the class was silent for a while. Then one of the students raised his hand. He said, man, $5,000 could buy a lot of Pokemon. I mean, you know, the dishonest thread was working in that little kid. And we all got a little bit of that in us, right? Okay, so let's have the honest moment. You've never stolen anything. So that means you've never taken a dime out of your mother's purse. Or you've never taken a bag of popcorn out of your roommate's stash at college. Some of us lived off our roommate's stash in college, but we didn't see it as stealing, right? But we did that. Or you've never looked over at someone else's test in school and even taken one answer, right? Or you've never taken a towel out of a Motel 6 and put it in your suitcase. Okay, so I want you to raise your hand if If you've never stolen anything, you've never even thought about taking something from the IRS, raise your hand. Keep it up. Come on. Wow, you're as wicked as the other two groups. There's only one hand up, and it's mine. I can't believe it. And now I'm the liar in the room. You guys are the thieves, and I am the liar. Because we all know, right? Now, we got to think about this now. Okay, there's a difference between being a sinner, which all of us are, and a chronic criminal, which they were. I mean, there's a difference, right? I mean, I was watching a psychiatrist at one of the news shows this week, and the topic was fact-checking of the candidates who are running for president. You ever seen some of that stuff? Like they'll do the debate, and then they fact-check, you know what I'm talking about? And, he lied here, and he lied here, and she lied here, and she lied here, and she lied here, and she lied. Well, I'm not going to get on that. But anyway, there's a lot of lying going on from all the candidates, right? And you're going, okay, now wait a minute. And then the psychiatrist says this, he says, I don't know, I mean, my words, not his. He says, none of us tell the truth. We're all liars at some level. And so he was like justifying the fact that they're lying to us. Now there's a difference between you telling your mother a fib to get out of something and someone running for the highest office in the land being a chronic liar, okay? I don't know about you, I'm not voting for that person, which makes the list really small, I think. I'm not sure. But it has to do with character and corruption. It has to do with a consistent pattern of behavior. And if that candidate has a pattern, I don't want anything to do with them. The Bible makes a distinction between an honest and a dishonest person from the point of character. And give you just a couple examples of that. Noah. You probably know who he is at some level. He was the guy that built the big boat. And it says that he lived in a place, in a land where the people were only evil all the time. They were evil all the time. And he stood out because he wasn't evil all the time. But was Noah perfect? I mean, read about Noah. Look at some of the stuff he did, especially after the ark was built. And you're going, wow, the guy's got some flaws. But he didn't have the pattern. Here's another example. Solomon in the Old Testament. He was the son of David. And it says in 1 Kings 11:6, it says, Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. Now, David was far from perfect. As a matter of fact, if you're here a couple of weeks ago, you heard his story kind of unfold, and you're going, wow, man, that guy was on the edge of really wicked at times. Actually, he showed us some really wicked stuff. But apparently, he wasn't chronic in the way that his son Solomon was. A sinner, but not necessarily chronic in his dishonesty. And it's kind of like this. You had two bananas, and one is black, and it's ripped open because of the fermentation, and it's dripping down your hand. And the other banana is got some little brown spots on it. You look at the two and you say, okay, they're both decaying, but one is edible while the other one, you're not going to probably want to bite into that. All people are sinners. But there are people who are moral, and there are people who are chronically immoral. Okay? These men who were crucified were notorious sinners. Now, one said, we're getting what we deserve. That was an honest moment, and it saved his soul, as we're going to see later. But here's the second thing about this. And we all, by the way, if you're honest, you see yourself somehow in that. Here's the second thing, that they were suffering men. They were suffering right along with Jesus. They were on crosses that were made just like his. Now, we don't know if they took the kinds of beatings that he took before he got there. We tend to think they did not, and here's why. Because Jesus died within hours of being on the cross. They probably wouldn't have died. It might have taken as many as 2 or 3 days for them to die, except they broke their legs so they'd have a quicker death. Nevertheless, they were suffering. They had the same kind of suffering. They were struggling for every breath. They were screaming with pain. Their legs were knotting with with cramps, and it was a miserable, you've seen the movie, and that's just the movie, right? You know. And I know that many of you here today are suffering. I know that. I don't know necessarily how you are, but maybe you have something happening in your physical life that you know is likely going to mean that you're going to die. Or maybe you're struggling with something in your life, something so tragic that you can't even talk about it. And you have to wake up with it in the morning, and you have to get up and go to bed at night, and all you think about while you're trying to go to sleep is that. I understand that. You know, with 1,300 people here at Third City, and with all the families that are here, we know there's a lot of hurting people in our church. We understand that. Several months ago, you know, it's great being a pastor in a large church, by the way. I love it. But one of the hard things about it is that there's more people that suffer. And so that means we're suffering with them more often. And a few months ago, we went to this calling rotation in our staff and with some key volunteers who love ministering to people, where instead of just 2 or 3 of us going to the hospital and calling on a regular basis, we have an expanded list, which has been great, not just for me and for those who do it, but also for those who have been able to get involved with that. They're really loving it. But I told someone recently who was hospitalized, I said, yeah, you know, it won't necessarily be me that you see unless I'm on rotation that day at the hospital. It'll probably be someone from our staff or one of these cool volunteers that are doing this for us. And I say, as a matter of fact, you really don't want to see me walk through the door. If I walk through the door, that probably means that it's getting pretty serious, you know. So then I started thinking about that. Oh, great, because I am on rotation, you know. So what if I get on rotation and I walk in the door on that, you know. I had to preface that, right? You're going to get a terrified look if I show up now. Don't worry, okay? I know a lot of you hurt. I know that. Some of you just live with physical pain, that maybe it's that you live with grief, and grief is not going anywhere for you. Or it could be, for many of us, it's that we've made so many bad decisions in our lives that now we have to suffer the consequences of our choosing. And there are consequences. No matter what they tell you, there are consequences to drinking too much. There are consequences to doing drugs. There are consequences to spending more money than you can make. And so we have to live with those, and it's hard, and it makes us suffer. People say, well, I guess this is my cross to bear. Job said, man is born to trouble as sure as sparks fly upward. And he knew. For many, our failure to deal with our sin and our compiling suffering leads to bitterness. And that's the third thing we see on these crosses of 2 men, bitterness. Matthew 27:44. In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Both of them taunted him. Now we say sometimes, especially in Celebrate Recovery, this is a phrase that's used there quite a bit, hurt people hurt people. Well, bitter people hurt people too. And you can see why these men would be bitter. I think you can understand that. You know, I read something about Jared Fogle. Does that name sound familiar to you? His first name should. Jared. Who did Jared represent until recently? Subway, right? Famous guy. I don't know if you know what's happened to Jared. You probably have heard. But he's begun a 19-year prison term for child sexual abuse. Apparently, the inmates haven't been too kind to Jared. And as a matter of fact, a while back, he got assaulted in prison. Some guy came up and slapped him in the face and called him all kinds of names. And so I was reading this article about it, and they were talking to an ex-convict who was asked about his situation and in prison. He said, yeah, they'll call him a chomo, child molester. They will make him suffer because there's 2 people, he said, that prisoners hate the most, child molesters and rats. And he's going to get it because not only that, he's famous. And they want to see his breaking point, and they will push it until it happens. And even then, he may not make it out of there alive. Now, I am in no way comparing Jared to Jesus. I want you to see the comparison between those who are abusing Jared in prison and the thieves on the cross and those around Jesus' cross who were abusing him. Because you see mentally that Jesus faced this. Both the thieves poured out their bitterness against Jesus. They taunted him, just like prisoners in a prison will pour out their bitterness on someone else in prison. And they knew Jesus was famous. They'd heard about the miracles. They knew that he was a man who had claimed to be without sin. They understood, the high marks that Jesus' life had lived out. They got that. They understood it. And so they said things like this, well, you can save us. If you can do that for other people, why don't you get off this cross and take us with you? They got it. They understood that. Now, we often talk about the fact that suffering can deepen your character or it can make you more sympathetic to people who hurt, and that is true. But suffering can also make you bitter. And it hardens hearts. And sometimes people get to the point, they don't want anything to do with God. You have a limiting disease and you say, God, how could you do this to me? I just don't get it. If you're really there, why do you let this happen? People say, well, if there's a God, why would he let my child be sick like this? What kind of God would let a child be born with such a chronic, sad sickness to have to live through? I prayed for years that I get married and I'm still single and lonely. Or I was baptized 2 weeks ago and my wife died 2 weeks. My wife died just like that. Now, what kind of God would reward me like that? After Job's 10 children were killed, after he lost everything through marauders who came and stole it, after a storm wiped out his home and all of his property, and after his health went to pot, here's what he wrote in Job 7:11, I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. And you might be there too. And maybe it's even understandable for the rest of us, because that's a lot to take. That's a lot to lose. And maybe you're losing a lot, and we get it. And I think God gets it, by the way. I don't think he's worried about it. I don't think he's concerned about that. But what he wants you to see is, see Jesus on the cross. Even though the crucified thieves taunted Jesus, he did not lash back. And the reason is because he was suffering too. He understood full well what they were going through because he was going through it too. You see, he was hurting too. And this is what we need to see about Jesus and the cross. Hebrews 4:15. We do not have a high priest who is not sympathetic with us. He's not one that can't be touched by our infirmities. You know why? Here's what it says. We have one who at all points has been tempted just as we are. But what's the difference between him and you and me? Yet he did so without sin. That's why his cross is different. That's what makes him Jesus. And that's where we're going to find our hope as we go forward. Maybe you're hurt and frustrated right now. Maybe you think God doesn't understand. Look at the cross. There's no loneliness, no physical agony, no emotional burden, no hatred that's coming at you, no failure that you felt that he himself hasn't been exposed to. He experienced. There were 3 men on those crosses that day. 2 were dishonest. 2 deserved to be there. Of those 2, one of them got it all wrong. He died a suffering, bitter death. Now look, you don't want to get it wrong. You think loneliness is hard, and so you're tempted to compromise your standards so you can have someone in your life. You think that life is short, so you might as well just grab as much as you can get going out the door, right? Because, hey, someone's going to get it. It might as well be you. Or you may think, you know what? I need to make peace with God, but I'm young. I'll get around to it. I'll get to it one day. But what if you drive out here on the 13th Street and you go over to 281 and you don't know it, but there's a semi coming down 281 that's not going to stop at that red light? What are you going to do then? You know what you're going to do? You're going to die. That's what you're going to do. And you know what? If you haven't done business with Jesus, you're not going to heaven. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but look, you know, if we can't tell that truth here in this church, we might as well not even open the doors. We might as well do something else. We're going to tell it. Of the two men, one missed his chance. He missed that opportunity that the third man received, the second chance. And the good news is that today you can have yours. And by the way, you didn't have to bring $640,000 or $4.5 billion for that matter. Okay, but if you did, I want to talk to you afterwards because we're building a building. So, you know, that's something else. That has nothing to do with this, right? In a few minutes, I'm going to explain to you how all that guilt, all that suffering, all that bitterness, you can hand it to Jesus, to Him. Now, Jesus told His followers when He gave them the Lord's Supper, do this in remembrance of me. He said, remember this. Remember I'm God. Remember that I am sinless. And even though you don't know this now, remember after I die on the cross that I'm going to raise from the dead. And remember that I did once it's done so that you can have hope too. You know, there were two thieves on that cross. One of them got that. One of them scorned his shame because of Jesus. The atoning sacrifice of Jesus for his sin. Peter Green said this, only the one who's prepared to own his share in the guilt of the cross may claim a share in its grace.